All right, welcome to Beyond Linux. I'm William Yu. I'm a Xojo employee here. And as you can tell from this picture, we're going to go beyond the black hole in this session. Okay, so probably asking yourself, why Linux? Well, I can tell you that Linux is probably the most popular machine to run web servers on. It's also used in Chromebooks because Chrome OS is built on top of Linux. Raspberry Pi runs Linux as well. And of course, it's used by astrophysicists. I don't know if you know, the Event Horizon Telescope that captured that black hole image was created using PHP, running on a Linux server. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the layers of Linux. The fundamental layer is the Linux kernel, which provides all the non-GUI essentials. And built on top of that, we call it the display server. This is the GUI layer. X11 is the most popular server out there, I believe. And built on top of that, you get these window managers. There's a lot of different window managers out there. XFCE is one. Mutter is another. Metacity was popular back in the day. And built on top of that, you have your GUI toolkits. The two most popular ones you might be familiar with, GTK and Qt. And on top of that, we have the desktop environment. And most distros run either GNOME or KDE. And what really differentiates a Linux distro is what package manager it uses. It either uses RPM, which is Red Hat based, or the Debian package. And so now you have all these distros that utilize either RPM or Debian, GNOME or KDE, GTK or Qt, and a various number of other window managers out there too. So if we look at a distro and what that looks like, we got Mint, which is Debian based. You can run the Cinnamon desktop, which is GNOME based. They also have a KDE desktop download you can also get. On Ubuntu, it's Debian based. They also provide GNOME and KDE downloads. Fedora is RPM based, which is Red Hat based. And they run the GNOME desktop. And the window manager on Mint, they use the Muffin window manager. On Ubuntu and Fedora and a lot of other distros, they prefer Mutter. And there's different variations of Mutter too. And down at the display level, some distros prefer X Windows, others have upgraded to Wayland. And Wayland is supposedly the future. It uses OpenGL as their graphics renderer. So with all these different distros, how do they come up with some kind of standard? Well, you can take a look at this website called freedesktop.org. It provides a list of protocols, MIME types, different things that each distro should support. Also on x.org, you can find out about more of these standard X server type features, I guess. And then they have this, what they call the Linux standard base, which is really the minimum set of APIs that each distro should support. And so if you create an app that uses one of these APIs, it should work on any distro. Okay, so let's talk about the differences between GNOME and KDE. So both are popular desktop environments. GNOME prefers GTK, and KDE prefers Qt. That's the main difference there. The other difference is GNOME is more Mac OS-like. On Ubuntu, for example, they run the Unity desktop, GNOME-based, and their menu bar is global, just like the Mac. And KDE is more Windows-like, mainly because it prefers Qt, and Qt, its control set and behavior acts more like Windows. All right, so let's look at the differences in button placements. As I mentioned, GNOME is more Mac OS-like, so you'll see the action button on the bottom right-hand side. And with KDE, since it's more Windows-like, you'll find the action button on the left-hand side. And GTK actually offered an API to swap the order depending on the distro you're running or the desktop environment you're running. But unfortunately, they deprecated this. So as far as I know, there's no replacement for it. So you have to figure out the button swap yourself. All right, so why did we choose GTK over Qt? And the easy answer is GTK is free. And Qt requires us to pay a royalty, which means if you create a Linux app using Xojo, you probably would have paid another royalty too. So to circumvent that, we decided to use the open and free GTK instead of Qt. If you're familiar with Qt is more object-based, while GTK is more, here's a bunch of functions you call. All right, so since 2017 R2, we've upgraded our Linux framework to use GK3. Before then, we used GK2. We've also required libunwind for 64-bit or Pi apps. Our console framework actually has slightly lower requirements because web servers generally don't upgrade their distros very often. So to allow you to build your app and run on a web server, we decided to slightly lower those requirements. We use this GStreamer library for movies and sound. And since 2018 R2, we've switched our HTML vir to using WebKit 2, which is the new standard. And for URL connection, we require libsoup, which is generally installed on all, if not most, distros. And of course, we support Pi, and we dropped support for Wheezy a while back, so we only support Jessie or later. And if you're interested in QEMU, that's an emulator for ARM processors and other processors. Make sure if you want to run Xojo built Linux apps or Pi apps that you download the ARM v7 kernel and the Raspberry Pi 2 architecture. All right, so why do we switch to GK3? For obvious reasons, it's newer, but also it had high DPI support that GK2 did not. And unlike Windows, GK3, just like Mac OS, only supports integral fraction scales. They do support, however, fractional scale for text. So you can specify 1.2 times scale and your text will scale at that. But your controls themselves will not know what 1.5 scale means. So it'll either pick 1 or 2 times scale. And GK3 added support for WLAN and mirror backends. As I mentioned before, WLAN is a Windows server layer that provides the GUI support for GTK, Qt. And GK3 extended this ability to customize and style your controls GTK2 had this feature, but with GTK3, they've totally extended that. And as you know, on Linux, it's really hard to determine the control sizes. In GTK2, it was an ordeal just to get GTK to return the correct natural size for a control. But with GTK3, it's a simple function call, and you can get that size quite easily. We'll take a look at the example in a minute. This might not be obvious. In GTK2, whenever a canvas was transparent, the way GTK2 worked was that canvas was naturally a part of its parent. And so it wasn't its own window. So to draw it transparently, we had to essentially flatten the control drawing order. And so whenever you put a control onto that canvas expecting that it'll clip, it does not, because it's really part of the window in order to draw it transparently. But with GTK3, this is not an issue anymore. Controls will clip properly to its parent without this transparent hack that we've added in GTK2. Also with GTK3, this might not affect you that much, but with our IDE, all the controls that are drawn are now drawn with GTK3's built-in draw into method. In GTK2, it was a bit of an ordeal to draw those controls for you. Also with GTK3, as we looked at before, GTK3 added more support for styling controls. They've also added this GTK inspector you can use at runtime to inspect the properties, the CS properties of your controls, to modify them, to see what they're doing, really. It's a nice debugger tool. All right, so let's talk about styling with GTK3. So they chose CSS to style controls. And there's a few ways you can do this. One, with a file on your machine located in this directory. You can also use their class. They call it GTK style context. And with this, what's great about using GTK style context is that you can programmatically style just your app. With the file approach, it's pretty much global. So your app will be styled, another app that you didn't write will be styled. But with GTK style context, you can just style just your app, or even just a single control as well in your app. All right, let's take a look at some demos here. All right, sorry for the small text. All right, let's begin looking at this whole CS style feature that GTK3 has. So in this example, I just have a button, and when you run the button, or when you run this project, this button inherits the default theme, which is great. Now, say I don't like the color of that button, and I want to change it. So, for example, this might be hard to see, but I'm going to go ahead and create this file we talked about, gtk.css. And I'm just going to change the background color of this button. Let's call it background color to red. Save that. Now when I run this, all buttons now will be red, including buttons that did not originate from your app. For example, the file manager now has all red buttons. So that's great. The file approach to changing or styling your controls are fine if you want a global sort of feel. But in general, you don't. And so let's take a look at an example of styling just your controls. So with this approach, can you see back there? Okay, it might be a little hard. Okay, so with this approach, I'm using their GDK style context. Got some declare set up. And this is the important part. I only want to style my application. So I pass that to this provider. I'm pretty much just saying the background color to something. And to show you what this looks like, let me first remove this global style so that doesn't conflict. All right, so I want to style all these buttons. So what I've done in the code is to individually style each button. And if you're familiar with CSS, you can also use the gradient feature to style your buttons a little more fancy. Okay, so that's an example of styling. I also wanted to show the GDK inspector. This question.
The styling, does that just apply to color and font, or can you move the XY coordinates of buttons?
So the question is the styling only for color? And no, there's a ton of properties you can customize. The padding, yes, where the label position is, position of things and border widths, all that can be styled. Okay, so probably can't see this.
You don't need sudo to make such changes globally, do you?
You don't. Yeah, so this file actually lives in your home folder under config GDK3.
It just affects the one user?
It will only affect the one user. That's correct. Yeah.
Can you, if you use those declares, can you bundle a CSS style file with your app, adjacent to it, rather than, you can kind of, if you distribute it with your app?
So the question is, can you distribute your own CSS file with your app? And the answer is yes, absolutely. I'll show you later an example where we're going to use a complete theme file to style our entire app. And you can simply drag that file into your project, use it as a string, and then style it that way. For many ways to be able to style your app for sure. Okay, so I just wanted to run through a quick example of this GK inspector. So to enable the GK inspector, there's this environment variable called GDK_debug. And if you set that to interactive, you'll see this GDK inspector window pop up. So here's a window. It might be hard to see. But anyways, with this inspector, you can go through your app, take a look at your button right here. And the nice thing is, if you're curious about what would happen if you change the background color, for example, let's say, I just wanted to know what it would look like if I did change the background color. So you can test your changes just like that. So it's nice just to see what style attributes you can modify, what they look like, before actually writing the code for it. So that's the GK inspector. So this might be different between distros, but on Mint, to enable high DPI, you would go in your preferences, under general, it's a party next door. All right, so under Preferences General, there's a desktop scaling preference, and you can just enable high DPI that way. And as you can see, the button has scaled, the text is scaled, so it's all working. All right. Let me see if there's any examples I was going to show here. Not quite. Okay, let's get that back to normal. All right. Go back to these slides here. Okay. Oh. It looked like there was one additional. Okay, I'm going to bring up this example that I talked about. Where we no longer have to do the transparent hack on the canvas. So let me load that up. There it is. Okay, so let's run this with the GDK2 build. I happen to have a copy already built. All right, so as I mentioned, to get canvas transparency to work with GK2, pretty much the canvas is really part of the window and not its own control. And so whenever this button should clip, because the button is parented on the canvas, it just draws completely outside its parent's bounds. However, this canvas is not transparent, which means it does have its own GDK window, they call it, and so that will clip just fine. All right, so let's see what that looks like in GK3 land. So this canvas is transparent, and you see that it does clip just fine with its parent. And we got that for free just by switching to GK3. Okay. All right, any questions about those demos? Yes?
I wasn't quite sure how to enable the inspector. Is that a flag that you pass as an argument before you launch your app?
So the question is, how do you enable that GDK inspector? Yeah, it was hard to see, but it's actually an environment variable. I exported GDK_debug, and the value equals interactive. And once that environment variable is set, that inspector will show up. So, okay. All right, let's talk about some Linux best practices. As you know, control sizes is a huge issue on Linux, and they depend on the theme. So on one distro, it might look fine, and then on another distro, it looks really constrained. Mainly because also the font sizes are larger on Linux than on the Mac or Windows. So that is something you will have to account for when you develop your Linux apps. So a lot of you have asked, how are you able to add your app to the start menu? And unlike Windows, where you create an installer and you add that to the registry, it's not quite the same, but it's pretty close. So the idea to start with, you should include an icon for this app that you want to add to start menu. And whenever you build your app, make sure to include these icons. And the trick here is creating this desktop file. So instead of modifying registry on Windows, it's just a desktop file on Linux. And the important part is, in this desktop file, you gotta be using the right categories. And to know what category to use, you can go to freedesktop.org. As I mentioned, they have a list of the standards. And there's a link for that. All right, so this is an example of Xojo being added to start menu. So we've added our app into the programming category, and it will show up there. And you might not be able to see this text, but we just have a desktop file. So our Debian package or RPM package will install this for us. And there's only a couple of things that are important. Obviously the name, the executable where it's found, the icon that it's using, and the categories where it fits into the start menu. Okay, let's take a look at how this looks. All right. Yeah, it's hard to hear myself think with all this, all this noise next door. Okay, I think what we're going to start with is control sizes. Control sizes is a problem, and obviously you can style your controls to eliminate the padding. I'm going to show you a couple examples. We'll talk about that styling in a minute, but first I wanted to take a quick look at how you obtain a natural control size in GK2 and the process and labor it took to get that info. So in order to get the control size in GK2, you had to hook into the event, and you had to wait for the event to tell you, hey, I've figured out the size for my control, so here we go. And so with GK2, it's a lot of work, a lot of code just to get the widget size, and then propagating up to your window and telling your controls that, hey, I've figured out the control size, and now I'm going to tell it to you. So it's a lot of code, a lot of work. But with GK3, this is a lot simpler. With GK3, it pretty much amounts to one function call, and that is get preferred height, get preferred width, and that's it. And from there, you can get not only the control's natural height and width, but also will factor in the width of the text too. So you can determine the correct width that fits your string. So it's quite handy. All right, so let's just run this example real quick. So we got two buttons here. One button's correctly sized because I'm using the call to get the preferred height and width, while the other button is kind of clipped because I didn't do that. So if you go that route, at least your buttons will be correctly sized. It'll look like other GDK apps. The buttons will be sized about the same. But if you don't like that approach, because it requires a lot of modifying your project to find the size for control, the other option is just to style your whole application, removing the padding and whatever else that makes that control so constricted. And with that approach, thankfully, we have a user on our forum, you probably know him by the name of Otter. He created this module for us. And what's nice about this module is that he's got pretty much figured out all the distros and the correct padding that each distro requires or needs to look correct, and it looks pretty good. So I'm just going to run this control demo. So as you can tell, nothing at all is clipped. Might be a little hard to see, but nothing at all is clipped. And it doesn't look any more different, I suppose, than other GK3 apps out there. The control size might look a little bit tinier, but it all just works. So if you can find this example, it's on the forums. It's actually pinned on our Linux target forum. And yeah, he's got it all figured out on each distro. And you can just call it from your open event to style your whole app, and voila, everything just works. So I gotta give him props for that. Now you're probably wondering, are we gonna use this with our own IDE? And the answer is probably, we should, right? We haven't done it yet. Okay. Okay, so the other example I want to show you was adding this desktop file. As you see, my start menu, if I go to the programming category, I just have the Xojo app installed there. There you go. All right, so I'm going to add my own built app in there. Okay. So assuming I built it. Let me see where I built it. Oh, interesting. It's shared as my Parallels desktop folder. Okay. This should work. All right, so as I mentioned, to add your app to the start menu, you create this desktop file in this directory called user share applications. And I am simply going to magically move my file and call it small.desktop. And of course I'm denied. All right. Okay, so I've got this smile.desktop file in my user share applications. I've got where the application lives in home parallel smile and what icon it's using. And if you can actually read that, it's the name of the built icon. Whenever you build an app for Linux and you have icons included, we create these image files next to the executable, and you can use those as part of your desktop file to add that to the start menu. So assuming this works, I've added to the category called development programming. And I found that out on freedesktop.org. So if that's all working, let's take a look at the start menu. Under programming, there's my Smile app. Of course, this is a little flaky. So there you go. So I can click on it, and it'll run my instance of Smile app. There you go, Smile. So generally, this is done with your installer, your Debian installer. Obviously, if you don't care to have an installer, you can simply create this desktop file in your user share applications folder and be done with that. All right, any questions so far? All right. Okay. So just a few Linux tips. Preferences, if you want them globally, which normally you don't want to store global preferences, but if you did, you would put them in the etc folder / your app name. But generally, you want to put your preferences in the user's home folder, and that can just live in your user home folder with a .application name. Just a note about the clipboard Linux. Whenever you get data from clipboard, what has to happen, unfortunately, is a run of the event loop to grab the clipboard data. So what might happen is when you try and grab the text from clipboard, your timer event might fire. So that's something to be aware of. All right, just a couple of Ubuntu features. As I mentioned, Ubuntu has their global menu bar just like the Mac, except the annoying part is whenever you click on it, it will deactivate your app. So if you have anything in your deactivate event that you don't want to fire, you might want to check that. And you're able to disable this menu, global menu bar, and have the menu bar live within your window if you set up this environment variable. Another environment variable that's handy is this overlay scroll bar. On Ubuntu, the scroll bar itself is not visible until you mouse over it, which is fine, but if you want to test on Ubuntu and make sure your content looks okay in other distros, you can also disable this feature by adding this environment variable. All right, so you're probably wondering, what's our direction on Linux? If you don't already know, GTK4 is prepping to come out this year, and it's going to be a pretty big release. It's updated its layout managers, so it's going to be a big change for us. It's going to come out with some new widgets. One of them I've seen is GK Video. So once we move to GK4, we'll no longer require libgstreamer. We'll just go ahead and use this new widget. So some of the other concerns is if we do support GK4, what's going to happen with our GK3 distros, right? So when thinking about that, if we do decide to go to GK4 early and provide that framework, we'll probably need to support GK3 distros as well, and that's something we'll have to think about to make sure your apps run with older distros and newer distros. All right, so that's my Beyond Linux session. Have I gone beyond Linux? Any questions for me? Yes? I didn't pick up that word. Timer. Timer, yes. Okay, so does a timer work the same on Linux as it does on Windows and the Mac? It does in the sense of it'll fire at the right period, except that period is very, it really depends on the OS or GTK in firing exactly at that time. Because I know on Windows, if you set the timer period to like 1 millisecond, it won't fire at 1 millisecond. Yeah, it'll fire at 15 or 20. whenever they tell us the time is fired. So, yeah. Did that answer your question? Oh, yes. So the statement was you can have a lot of timers on Linux at the same time. They do get queued. So if you're firing 10 different timers and the first one takes a long time to handle the action event, the other ones will queue up. So that part might be a little different from Windows and Mac, but yeah, I'm not entirely sure how much it would affect your app in general in that case. But
There's no guarantee on any.
there's really no guarantee on any timer, that's correct. But they do queue up a little bit worse with GTK, and that might be something you ran into. So
Could you thread that?
the statement is, could you thread that? You could thread anything. I mean, you could thread that. You could thread
That's always my go-to. If I'm having problems with something in the main thread is tying something else up, whether is to thread it.
Yeah, threading your app in general is probably a good idea to free up whatever the system needs to do. So it's a possibility. Thank you.